been a lot of wars, bub. The brave always die first.
Xmen 97 episode 9 made me cry for some happy moments and some not so happy moments as well. But Magnus has had
Enough.
Salutations and fist bumps, folks. Welcome back to the grid. This episode gives us a battle that we've been waiting for and building up to from the start of this series. And it gives you Easter eggs literally from the credits. So there's little time to waste. Let's ride. As the episode opens, we hear the voice of Logan, aka Wolverine.
Previously on Xmen.
The last will and testament of Charles Francis Xavier.
Which tells an early picture that something is either going to happen to or because of Wolverine in this episode. We also see directly after that the death certificate of Charles Xavier, which has a date on it, which is somewhere slightly after the last episode of the original animated series. But now that we know that he's back, it begs the question of how in the world did they not know that he wasn't dead? I mean, I know that Lilandra interferes with this whole situation at some point, but they had a whole funeral situation for him. Who had the body? This also gives us a clue on why Magnus was chosen to be the leader of the X-Men, because Professor X was trying to allow Scott and Jean a way of escaping the group so that they could have a normal life. We also then hear Cable describe where Bastion got his funds from for the attack on Genosha, specifically for his Prime Sentinel operation.
His name's Bastion. He used the fallout from Genosha to get backing for his Prime Sentinel program,
aka OZT. We further recap that Magneto has now taken the entire world off of the electric grid because of the EMP that he sent the world over.
Magneto has blacked out the Earth.
And because around this time in the late 90s, electricity was starting to become a really big situation in terms of communication, with cell phones hitting the streets and personal computers hitting actual homes, this literally puts the entire world in a chokehold. Then as the credits start, we see Cable and Apocalypse yet again, but after that, we do not see Nimrod coming out of a master mode. We do see Scott and Jean again as the Phoenix, so maybe that side of her powers is going to possibly come back or make a resurgence later on or in another series. And then towards the end, we see Asteroid M, which humbly, I will admit, in a previous breakdown, I called that Genosha by accident. But again, I'm rectifying that here. Seeing this means that we probably will see Evil Magnus or Evil Magneto at this point throughout. And remember, the people that are usually running through the X-Men clashing at the end of the credits? Yeah, they are now Prime Sentinels, and they're still running from the mutant. But this is not the case in any other episode, even inside of episode 8. After the credits, we get a glimpse of Charles sitting or laying inside of his bed, which looks like it was the same one that he was laying in at the end of the original animated series, but obviously in a much more destructive room. But this also further depicts his weakness after leaving the exoskeleton that he had on Shi'ar.
Wasn't aware my X-Men and I were playing make-believe. Much like my legs in this armor's exoskeleton.
We then display Magnus showing up on a shoreline, which looks like it possibly is around the area of Australia. But because of what he does to the Earth's polarity, it is possible that these waves that we see that are crashing against the shoreline are super huge because of the polarity, again, that is now taken away from the Earth. But this also could be a nod to the fact that water can be used as power or energy if it is used in the correct way. So this kind of is a double entendre in terms of what he can do with electricity and what can be used in place of it. But this also is a nod to the fact of what he can do or has done in a literal sense and figuratively to the X-Men crew, because all of his actions have a rippling effect to everyone associated with him, including Charles. And this is the first time that we've seen Magneto with his helmet outside of the danger room, because the first time that we saw that was when Roberto actually was inside of the danger room and encountered a figurative situation where Magneto was the enemy. But notice what his powers have now done, stopping every freight ship on the sea. Literally, because they can't figure out where to go and they don't have power at all. Then Bastion is shown returning to his hometown, which again is at a standstill. And as an angry mob shows up again in front of Jubes and Roberto, which is a callback to episode 3, you can hear them talking about the fact that electricity has now gone away and they're going to do some really rough things to them. Unbeknownst to them though, Storm is now back. Yay! Then the image of Eric putting on his helmet for the first time, at least in this series, reminded me of X-Men Unlimited #2, which is a beautiful depiction in comics of his powers, or in terms of his backstory and why he is the way he is. And then Charles opens his front door, or his room door, and we see the damage that has now been caused to the mansion, down to the studs inside of that place.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
From there, we see where Magneto is going to get the surface, or the surface area, for Asteroid M again, but this time it comes from the sea. And as Bastion lays his mother back inside of her bed, we see a few things around him, specifically the Master Mode Prime Sentinel picture that is hanging above her bed, which more than likely was drawn as Bastion was a child, then turned into an actual painting. But this is an early depiction of what his life would become. But he also now says,
It's finally quiet, Mother.
Which basically is a callback to the fact that he speaks to machines and they speak back to him. And now, since the EMP from Magnus has gone throughout the world, there are no electric waves or machines to talk to or talk back to him. And this fact is brought home even more so when we pan to the left and actually see a transformer, not that type of transformer, but an electric transformer that would send electric waves around or through a particular part of the world. Then Storm and Forge clear the area, and Storm is back in her black suit glory, and my goodness. But this is again accompanied with a version or a variation of her Omega level music. But again, that black suit, whoo, yes Lord. And the way that Jubes reacts to seeing Storm would have been me as well. But this also calls back to the fact that Jubes and Storm have a deep relationship, and it brings me back to episode 3, where we saw the earrings, or what looks like to be earrings, that possibly were given as a gift from Storm to Jubilee. We then hear the voice of Jean, who is now again playing the mom role for this particular situation against or within the confines of Scott and Charles.
The world is going to end in 12 hours, so you two better make this fast.
And we get a glimpse of Charles wearing his blanket, or his classic blanket that we've seen all over the X-Men series. But this moment, in terms of them, or him explaining why he did what he did in terms of choosing Magneto as the leader, gives a shining light on why he would really want them to actually have a normal life, because they've been with him since they were teenagers. Literally, they were the first ever X-Men to join his school. And specifically, at least in the comics, Jean doesn't come along in terms of being an X-Men until later on in the series. And Charles also makes mention of the fact that they graduated a long time ago, which feels like a callback to the very last episode of the original animated series, which was called Graduation Day. Which, by the way, the original animated series was not canceled. People just decided to go and do other things, because Fox actually gave them the green light. And it makes sense as to why they would have, because this series is no different. But as the conversation continues, Scott mentions that he would have always been back in this situation, in this particular situation of sending Nathan off to the future, battling Bastion or what have you, because he can't escape his leadership role in terms of the X-Men, which is also what happens inside of the comics. Because even through his leadership situation, Scott does become public enemy number one when he is at the helm after the untimely death again of Charles Xavier, but this time by the hands of Scott. And this happens in the Uncanny X-Men series that is written by my favorite comic writer, Brian Michael Bendis. But this entire conversation is a literal father-son moment between Scott and Charles, which is possibly something that we've all been waiting for, possibly even since we were kids, because it shows the level of dynamic that is inside of their relationship, which again, we also have a callback to the first episode of this series. Then as Rogue wakes up, she seems to have been dreaming, or inside of her moments of rage, she had all the traumatic situations that happened to her pressed down after taking the blow to the head from Prime Trask.
No!
Rogue.
I feel like I've been run over by a hay baler fixed with a jet engine.
Because when she wakes up and Nightcrawler actually comes to her aid, she asks if Remy survived, which before she knew that he didn't. Then as Storm, Forge, Roberto, and Jubes show back up to the mansion, they see the chaos that has happened.
Oh, shucks. We missed the hoedown.
And literally Storm's face is like, bruh, I left y'all for 5 minutes and this is what y'all do? But notice here that Jean, when she sees Storm, does not call her Storm. She calls her Aurora, which to me signifies that their relationship in terms of their sisterhood is really deep and the bond is strong. And the nerd group, in terms of Beast and Forge, nerd out a little bit on Forge's invention of his leg and how he was able to escape the EMP that is again across the entire world from Magnus. And Forge says,
Thought about it.
But later on, Storm describes what the Earth is actually feeling because she can actually feel the electric current or the electricity leaving the Earth. Then, as Logan says,
Well, Magneto ain't gonna change his mind just because we say please. The man just declared war on the whole planet. His day ends one way.
Notice the face that Rogue actually makes here, because that is a foreshadowing situation for later on when we get to Asteroid M. Because the way that she's looking, she's playing it cool, no doubt, but it already looks like she's made her decision if the door is opened. Now, since we're talking about Prime Sentinels and how they're going to be stopped, let's take a quick pause and take a look at where they come from in comics. So they were created in comics in April of 1997 inside of X-Men Volume 2, number 65. And they've gone by some different names as well, which include Bio-Sentinels, Omega Primes, and Transmode Sentinels as well. But in the comics, they were again shut down by S.H.I.E.L.D. And as Charles describes his first encounter with Bastion, we can see early rifts between the newest member in Roberto and Charles when he says,
Didn't you also believe it was a good idea to hand the bad guy your school?
But this also gives Scott a room to flex his leadership muscles to his mentor.
That's enough. Lame game is over, people. World ends in less than 12 hours. Kurt will teleport us to Muir Island.
Then as Beast and Forge make the Prime Sentinel shock collar, they then explain and impress Storm with the explanation on how that technology is going to work. But notice Storm's eyes when they make mention of neutralizer tech.
We can use neutralizer technology to permanently disable his control of Prime.
Because the look that she gives to both of them could literally cut through a brick. Then the professor rolls up on Rogue and he name drops the Thieves Guild, which we saw in episode 7. And we also now see Rogue's true feelings about the professor being back inside of the mansion, because she says if you saw us as humans and not just students, you would see that we were more than just pawns on a chessboard. But in the conversation, as Charles lists off all of the people that have died from Genosha, he also mentions Mora, who I believe he is talking about Mora McTaggart, which again is another callback to X-Men Unlimited number 2. Then enter Magneto, and he brings with him the entire construction of Asteroid M. But as he descends on the lake on top of the mansion, you can also see aurora colors inside of the sky, because at this point there are no lights to pollute the sky from actually seeing them. And it also feels like the writers were sitting around a calendar of some sort that would depict when these colors would actually be shown in real life, because it actually happened around this same time that this episode aired. But when Magnus calls Lilandra
Your Shi'ar bird queen,
that is right up there for me with Milky Way Ghetto. Bruh, these writers and their one-liners are literal gold. Then Magneto calls back to the time at the bar, which is a classic moment between the two of them, which we've seen in X-Men First Class. But this moment, if you don't know, is when they discuss a world where mutants and humans can coexist, which is what Charles has always been fighting for. But Magneto has been on the fence around this particular idea a few times, which at this point, it looks like he's jumping off of that fence completely. But Magneto also then mentions the last moments that he had with Leech, whom he had made a promise to back a few episodes ago.
And I promise you, child, you shall never be afraid again.
Because Magneto would take care of them. And he later says gods abandon those who believe in them. Mutants do not, which feels like a nod to what we saw in the beginning of Thor, Love and Thunder, where Gore actually goes to his god and actually tries to find food and water for his daughter, but is met with ridicule and laughter. But again, as he's giving this monologue, notice how fidgety Rogue actually is, which tells me again that she already had her mind made up from the beginning, because when the door is opened, like I said earlier, she does not hesitate to join his crew. But when she joins Mag's team, she mentions the potential deaths of other mutants, which at this point also includes Jean, which we've seen a bunch of times inside of this animated series from the original to now. And it's also a partial foreshadowing situation of what could come later. But she also mentions that Morph was tossed to the wolves not 30 minutes after joining the crew, which is a callback to the very first episode of the animated series. Then inside of the hangar, we see a few cars that are modeled after 90s situations, which include a Jeep, a 90s style Porsche, which I believe that's probably Scott's, what looks like a Rolls Royce, but again, a possible early or 90s version, a motorcycle in the colorway of an old school Wolverine, what looks like a Jetson space shuttle, and two different versions of Professor X's hover chair. The yellow version, which is usually seen around the mansion, and another which also could be used for battles. But if I'm not mistaken, this is also an earlier version or a nod to an earlier version of this chair in the comic. Then in the background of Cable, we see each of the original X-Men's suits, which includes Jean's Marvel Girl. And the black leather line is another callback to the first X-Men movie. We then finally get the chance to see Bastion as the Master Mode replacement. And when we do, inside of this moment, we also get a very heartfelt moment between Jean and Storm, when we get one of the best one-liners inside of this series. Again, I've said this a lot, but there are a lot of them, which shows their deeply rooted sisterhood. When Jean says,
"Make them mind your weather, sister.
And them weather your mind."
Bruh, these writers were writing. And once again, my favorite sound, or at least sound effect inside of this series, returns: Storm's Omega level music. Then as the crew splits and heads to the island, as they walk behind them, you can see a severed or a possible monument to a Sentinel head. And as they explore the island, we get a callback to episode 7, which is the diner that we saw at the end of that episode. And by the look of everything around this island, it looks like Bastion has been stuck in the 1950s and 60s for a long time. And we get another cameo given to us by Morph, which this time is the Hulk. And as he's inside of the spinning tornado that he hurls at a Sentinel, it looks like he's getting some help from Jean because of the blue hue that is around him as he's spinning. And we even get the classic one-liner from the Hulk, albeit Morph's version, Morph Smash, which then sends a Sentinel head hurling through the air to another diner sign. And then Beast pulls a Rick James, Charlie Murphy moment.
What is the 5 fingers say to the face? What? Slap!
But this saying is also a koan, which is a paradoxical question. Then as Sinister and Jean fight, he tells her that if she asks nicely, that he will explain when he switched her. And thanks to a friend of this channel, I went on the rabbit hole trail to actually find out when that was. And it actually happens in the original animated series in the episode of Reunion. But it is at this moment that Sinister knew that he had messed up, because Jean humbles that man quickly. Then as the rest of the crew hits Asteroid M, we get a glimpse of what could possibly be the Mir space station. It could also be Atlantis, the Russian space station, which, because both of them were in space at the same time, or at least in the same year. But if it is the Mir space station, the look on the crew member that looks outside of the window in terms of the frightening look that he has possibly could have been modeled by an actual situation on that space station, because inside of it was a fire. And as the crew comes in, they use Kurt's teleportation powers to leave the ship, but unbeknownst to Rogue and Roberto, because Rogue uses her incredible strength to literally brute force open the ship, which again, that is a ton of weight that she is moving. And this made me think that she would have been really helpful against the gauntlet battle that happened inside of Infinity War. She would have been incredibly useful there, because instead of using Star-Lord to take the gauntlet off of Thanos, it could have been Rogue. And yes, I'm still holding on to Star-Lord's debacle of that situation, because you had one job, my guy.
Tony Case, we almost got this off!
But we also get a chance to hear Rogue call her brother by the only name that she would probably be able to call him, Elf, which is possibly a play on the fact that his ears do make him look like an elf. Then we hear Rogue say,
"Time out, sugar. You're playing to kill."
Which again calls back to the earlier part of this episode when Logan said that his day in terms of Magnus was only going to end one way. But another classic one-liner from this series, at least at this point from Magneto, which is probably something that we've all wanted to say to the professor: shut up.
Shut it up, Talbot.
And now when Morph is cloaked as Sinister and Bastion says, "Know your role," it is very close to that shut up moment, which feels like someone on the writers team was actually a 90s wrestling fan, who wasn't at that point, and took that from The Rock. Then as Jean summons Scott telekinetically, we get another Dragon Ball Z moment between Cable and Jean. Then as business starts to pick up a little bit further, Logan actually is the one that grabs the helmet from Magneto. But this tells me two things. One, that he possibly heard or overheard the telekinetic message that Charles was sending to Scott. And it also shows the restraint, the really high restraint that Magneto uses here, because he knows that he can literally take out Logan with ease because of what's in his body. Then as Charles gets blasted by Scott, which takes Charles's momentum away from torturing Magneto in the air, this seems like an early indication of what will happen later on, or possibly will happen later on, and maybe it might happen as soon as season 2, because we know that this has already been greenlit for another season and possibly a third. But this is also a slight callback to what actually does happen in the comics, because again, like I mentioned earlier, Scott does kill Charles. But this exchange between Charles and Magneto gives us a clue that Onslaught may be around the corner, possibly again in season 2. And then the moment that probably shocked all of us, Wolverine stabbing Magneto. And when he says,
"Been in a lot of wars, bub. The brave always die first."
Logan. That is a callback to the first season of the animated series. But then the moment that we all knew could happen, but we were not sure until it actually did. The adamantium being ripped from Logan's body, which is a callback to what happened inside the comics in 1993's X-Men number 25, which kicks Logan's healing factor into overdrive, so much so that it almost is non-existent. Okay, classic writing, classic moments inside of this episode and this series in general. And if you're still on the nostalgia train like I have been, go ahead and check out this episode or this playlist right up here and this one right over here if you want to go back down the memory lane of X-Men 97 from the beginning to now. And until next time, y'all be smooth, blurred out.